All right, welcome everyone to this week's Ronin seminar. This week we've got Zach Stein, who's going to talk to us about stuff in his new book that has just come out. Take it away.
Thank you, John. So thank you for having me here. It's actually, I'm very excited. I haven't spoken about my book yet. So a few words about me before I get going. So let's see. I am what's sometimes called high achieving dyslexic, which means that it's not a coincidence. I'm a theorist of education. And so I went to Hampshire College, which is a unique school, and then the Harvard University Graduate School of Education, where I worked with Kurt Fisher and Howard Gardner, Catherine Elgin. Along the way, I co-founded with Dr. Theo Linda Dawson Lectica, which is a nonprofit that's dedicated to using the new sciences of learning, and especially developmental psychology, to redesign testing infrastructures very broadly in the K-12 system and in the realm of adult assessment. So recently I've stepped back from Lectica and have been writing and doing consulting work, and am now a scholar here at the Ronin Institute. And so this book I'm going to talk about is my second book. My first book was my dissertation, which was published by Routledge under the title Social Justice and Standardized Testing. And I focus on John Rawls's theory of justice and the history of standardized testing. So I kind of look backwards in that book. This book, I'll share my screen now. So this book that's coming out probably late summer, early fall, putting the final touches on. Of course, as a dyslexic, the hardest part is the final part. And so my wife is, Megan, is a very skilled copy editor. And so she and I have been going over the final proofs of it. And so it should be out soon. And like I said, my previous book looked backwards, and this book is looking forward. This is in some ways a book of educational futurism, but it is also a book that calls for really radical changes in the way we think about education and theorize education. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through the key themes of the book and kind of give an overview of the book, pausing in some places to elaborate what I think are important details. And so that'll be the plan. So this is the best way to actually frame the book. And this was drawn on a napkin for me by a colleague. And basically, it's the structure of educational crisis. And this happens both for individuals and collectives, which is to say, anytime the task demands of what you have to do outstrip your actual capabilities, you're in a learning crisis. You need to transform or fail, or change what you're trying to do. And so this, I think, is one way to characterize what's happening on the whole for our culture in this historical moment. We are facing an educational crisis of unprecedented proportion, and it's trickling down into the life world of everyone. And that means that many individuals are themselves in a situation of educational crisis. And of course, those people most in that situation aren't the young people, the people who are actually in school. And so what I'm arguing is that unless we change schools very radically, unless there are major changes to this very structure of schooling, those young people now being socialized into our society will not be able to meet the task demands made of them in order to reproduce the social system. So it's a strong argument. So you notice these learning curves, and then you look at these data. And so the key chapter, the first chapter in the book is called Education and Anthropocene. And it allows me to make this broad argument where I can contextualize education in the context of global crisis, global meta-crisis. So these come from some of the work that's being done on the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene has to do with the melding and forever now inextricably bound relationship between the biosphere and even some of the geological features of the Earth and humans. And so what you're seeing here are socioeconomic trends, which are mirrored by Earth system trends. And what this means is that, and you'll see all of these are quasi hockey stick type things. And this is exactly back to the first figure, which shows, well, yeah, the task demands of what it means to live in society and the task demands of sustaining human civilization are becoming more complex. You know, each one of these key Earth systems and each one of these key socioeconomic trends is turning into a problem to be solved. Let's put it that way. So what I do in the preface of the book, because it's a collection of essays, what I do in the preface of the book is weave together these essays with a set of themes. And so this is the only text-heavy slide, which I'm going to kind of read to you in my whole deck. But it's worth getting these themes correct and clear. So the book talks about, as I've already done, putting education in the context of a global meta-crisis. And by meta-crisis, what I mean is that it's not one crisis, it's actually a crisis of crises. It's a crisis that has to do with the confluence of many other crises. So in that context, I'm saying that traditional approaches to thinking about educational systems, which have depended on human capital theory, are now obsolete, if they were ever really good. So it's a strong critique of especially reductive human capital theory, which I'll talk about later, as a way of thinking about the function of education in society. So I'm pointing at the interdependence between educational organizations, the teacherly practices that occur in them, and the rest of society and culture. Kind of related to that is the potentially revolutionary impact of computer technologies on educational practice. So I think these things speak for themselves, right? It's the culture and society and the technological basis on which education takes place. As we go from the chalkboard to the flat screen, right? From the chalkboard to the smartboard, we're changing the nature of teacherly practice in a very fundamental way. So that's key. So then part of that transformation of teacherly practice has to do with the transformation of the nature of teacherly authority. And this is a particular problem now, given the the flourishing of certain postmodernist views, which question authority, period. And I'm saying that obviously there's pathological forms of authority, like there are pathological forms of authority. And yet there are very important forms of authority like teacherly authority and parental authority, which should not be used pejoratively, but should be actually researched into their structure. So one of the things I do in this book is look at the structure of teacherly authority from the perspective of cognitive science and developmental psychology and philosophy. So, and then related to this issue has to do with, well, what are teachers allowed to talk about? And as the meta-crisis deepens and the existential issues get more complex that humanity faces, I'm saying that we're going to actually need to revisit the role of religiosity and spirituality as an aspect of human development and education. And I'll talk about that more. And then what kind of ties it all together is the need to engage in some serious out-of-the-box thinking, which is to say some concrete utopian theorizing. Adjacent futures, near adjacent futures, which are not a matter of resources, but a matter of political will and imagination. And so much of what I lay out here could be seen as utopian, especially my vision for a kind of self-organizing educational hub network to replace our big dinosaur schools, a bunch of micro schools that are all related. And I also lay out 13 social miracles, which I see as the condition for the possibility of actual schooling. So these are things like basic income guarantees and guarantees of life. Continuation of the biosphere, for example, needs to be assured if we want to educate in any kind of sincere way a generation that's going to reside in the future. And so, yes, I'm speculating, but the point here is that in times of crisis and in times of rapid transformation, there needs to be a sense of what's possible, not just what's bad about what's going on, but what we can do next. So one of the things that holds the book together is my work in metatheory. And so metatheory is a kind of super discipline, and it is often characterized as part of the emergence of the metamodern phase of cultural development. And so that's a mouthful. And so we know modernism and postmodernism, and the question of how many prefixes we can affix to modern is a good one. But the metamodern is unique, and the metamodern is a structure of feeling that emerges after postmodernism. So the metamodern doesn't just seek to fragment and multiply perspectives and subjectivities. The metamodern seeks to actually reintegrate those perspectives that have been fragmented. If the modern takes a singular perspective and the postmodern takes all possible perspectives, the metamodern steps in to organize all of those perspectives, usually in some kind of hierarchy or some kind of set of comprehensive categories, if you're doing metatheory in a metamodern way. Now, there are metamodern forms of aesthetics, metamodern literature, et cetera. It's an emerging epoch, I believe, and I think it's useful to think about. This here are the four quadrants of Ken Wilber's integral metatheory, which is one of several metatheories that I use throughout the book. I find his to be particularly clear. And so what you're seeing here is a kind of checklist to assure epistemological comprehensiveness for interdisciplinary investigation, which is to say that if you're doing an investigation into something that's very complicated, like education, you want to make sure that you're covering all your bases and not just looking at it through one particular set of perspectives, right? So this is the postmodern insight that you don't want to take one perspective, certainly not the perspective that's been dominant and oppressive for so long. You want to take many, many, many perspectives. What this does is organize perspectives. And it says there are disciplines and perspectives that deal with the subject. So for example, this would be the experience of the student in the classroom. This is the upper left quadrant. So there's the experience, there's the first person experience of the student, which can't be neglected. Now, the first person experience of the student is related to the physiology of that student, the neurochemistry, especially stress hormones in schools, right? So what the student experiences as internally, anxiety, has a neurochemical mirror or relation, which could also be investigated, right? Similarly, in the lower right-hand quadrant, you could look at the student entirely from the perspective of the school system and all of the forms of measurement that encode the student within the infrastructure of the bureaucracy and the school buses and the roads and the actual building, all stuff that is about the systems of education. And then there's the culture, the lower left quadrant, which has to do with the interiors of the collective, right? Not just the experience of the student, but what's the culture of the school? So in each of these four quadrants, there's whole branches of educational theory and neuroscience and things that are so-called not educational theory, but as someone who does deep educational theory, actually everything's related to education. And so yeah, so that's integral metatheory, which I use alongside several other metatheories, including the dialectical critical realism of Roy Bhaskar and a couple others. So that's worth thinking about. Now, part of metatheory, especially integral metatheory, is this is one of the things that allows us to get beyond human capital theory. And so it's important to recognize that human capital theory is basically theorized into the lower right quadrant in Wilber's diagram. Right? Human capital theory says that the function of education is to produce workers, basically. I mean, this is like a terrible simplification, but that's, at the end of the day, if I was explaining it to a middle schooler, I'd say that. I'd say human capital theory says that the skills and capacities that are developed within schools are ultimately to be fed into the economic system. And the marker of a successful school system is one that can effectively and efficiently populate the roles within the economy with the appropriate skills and subjectivities and dispositions that were fostered during school. And so what that means is we measure educational success by the degree to which education raises the GDP. So if you want to really simplify, you'll notice I'm mentioning measurement here a lot. The kids are measured in school. We measure educational effectiveness at the level of the school and the level of the country in terms of numbers and measures. This is going to be a theme that is woven throughout the book, and a theme in my meta-theoretical investigations in general have to do with measurement and measurement technologies, something I'll return to. So, but what human capital theory did was allow for the triumph of objective measurement in education. and the emergence of what I call the education commodity proposition, which is the idea that the best way to understand education is as a commodity. And the education commodity proposition, similar to the labor commodity proposition, which argues that labor is a commodity. And what that does is it reduces theorizing about education, which is to say the education commodity proposition has us thinking about things like return on investment in education, right? It has us thinking about quantifying in terms of finances and the structure of, flows of people as being related. So that's one of the things that I argue against, is the use of standardized testing to encode the education commodity proposition onto the subjectivity of the student, so that there are financial consequences for how they do on the SAT. This is true. So one of the things that the whole book is trying to do is to say we got to shake loose from thinking about education as being entirely wedded to the economy and start thinking about education very differently, in part because the economy is going to be very different 10 years from now. But I'm getting ahead of the story. Okay, so that was metamodern meta-theory, which is part of the book. But I also do a lot of theorizing in human development and try to bring together several different models of learning and several different models of, the way the human develops over time. These developmental models, let's say the neo-Piagetian work. And this is a quote that frames a section heading of the book and characterizes in many ways, my view of what's wrong with educational psychology. Despite the dominance of cognitive science for the past couple decades, the evidence has not suggested that the mind is computer-like. If you look at it, what it's suggesting is actually that the mind is basically the opposite of a computer. The mind is much more like an ecosystem, which is my preferred metaphor for the mind. But the way we measure the mind and the way we talk about the mind has been deeply affected by the metaphor of the mind as a computer. So you'll remember that Freud changed history by using the metaphor of a steam engine, right? Which was one of the key technologies of his day, that the psyche has energy, the energy builds up, it needs to be released. This kind of psychodynamic theory was about this basic metaphor of steam. And so the metaphor of the computer has been very dominant. So, and again, it reflects our obsession with the most sophisticated technology and then like this weird move where we take it and encode it onto the subjectivity of the people in that culture who are run by that technology. And so, when you're looking at the mind as computer metaphor, and if you look at it carefully, and there's a table in my book where I compare the mind as computer metaphor with the mind as ecosystem metaphor. And what's striking is that the mind as computer metaphor is really bad. Like so for example, if you're not a good learner, it means you've got broken hardware, right? It means that you can accurately characterize the total power of someone with a single number, IQ, similar to the kind of computing power of a computer. It also has you thinking about teachers as repair people or factory workers that are dealing with a complex, or rather a complicated object that kind of can be fixed or updated in a mechanical way. So I'm trying to steer us away from that metaphor and towards a metaphor where we think of the mind as this organic, very complex, evolving organism or set of organisms. So the mind as the ecosystem metaphor allows us to think of the mind as metabolizing its environment and as having within itself internal complexity that can create growth. And it also means that the metaphor changes and the teacher is no longer a repair person or a factory worker. The teacher is now much more like a gardener or someone who tends to the maintenance of ecosystems. It also means that each student is unique, as opposed to a computer metaphor where if you're not like this kid, there's something wrong with your hardware. By definition, each ecosystem is different from each other ecosystem, and you should expect that and leverage that. So when you think about the mind as an ecosystem, you get that advantage. And then there's a whole list of them. So I'm doing deep theory in human development, and I work from a developmental model that is based on the work of my advisor, Kurt Fisher. And it's a neo-Piagetian model. And what this tells us, I'm not going to rehash the whole thing. What it tells us is that there are very different, qualitatively distinct capacities that emerge over the course of the lifespan. And we need to respect the internal working of the organic development of the mind and not impose upon it what we wish it was, as if it was a computer that we could software update. Instead, we need to be able to track growth patterns. And what Kurt did, along with some other colleagues, was to apply dynamic systems modeling techniques as used in biology to track the development of psychological capacities across these levels. And Kurt demonstrated very clearly that what you see in growth is not the stereotyped Piagetian ladder of growth, but in fact, what you see in growth is a very dynamic, very kind of like rhythmic up and down with bifurcations and nonlinear jumps and other dynamics that reveal a mind to be not mechanical and lockstep, but in fact, fluid, contextualized, and changing moment to moment up and down this skill scale here, right? So I don't want to linger too long on the learning theory, but there's a lot to say. So along that skill scale, which is the far left here, there have been other researchers who have looked at how various domains of capacity unfold and become more abstract and complex. So from the top to the bottom here, this reads from early childhood through very mature, highly educated. And again, what we're looking for are school systems that don't put a ceiling on people's development, right? So for example, a nationalistic school system will not allow for the emergence of level 6 moral reasoning, right? A nationalistic school system, especially one that's national-ethnocentric, is going to constrain the reflective ability of adolescents intentionally to keep them thinking below a universalistic moral view, right? So that the power of these developmental models is that they allow us to give aspirations and to critique those things which inhibit the full flourishing of these capacities, which are mapped out. This is a map of human potential is one way to think about it. So I use maps like these to characterize some of what needs to take place when we're thinking about education reform. And then this last one is very interesting in terms of the ecosystem metaphor and the best way to characterize the mind as dynamic. So this is basically a very complex representation of a psychotherapeutic dyad that has basically 118 conversational turns. You can see it there along the bottom axis. And what it's tracking is both the developmental level, which is the gray upper line, and then the conceptual content, which is the black lower line. Right? So what we're seeing here is that the number of concepts varies. The black line goes up and down. The complexity or difficulty of working with those concepts varies. Right? The person is moving between very complicated forms of reasoning and simpler forms of reasoning in the same conversation. Right? And then the beads along the string at the top, right? The black and white kind of diamonds, these are emotional coding. So what they did was videotape, and they were able to code the emotional dynamics. And you'll see that the emotional salience and the affect present in the conversation varies with the complexity of the conversation and the total conceptual load of the conversation. So what this is like a time capture of kind of the natural behavior of learning, which is nothing like a simple Piagetian ladder and also nothing like a computer that simply gets a download. What we're looking at is the sciences of learning telling us that our schools are broken. The sciences of learning are telling us that each kid in the classroom is going to have such a complex and unique experience that we either constrain that or we leverage that. So this is some of my messaging in the book has to do with, listen, this is not just political, right? The mind works in a certain way, as the body works in a certain way. So there are things that work and do not work with regards to the human body in terms of healing illness. Similarly, there is a reality to the structure of the mind and how it works, and education has long neglected to take account of this. If we continue to ignore the sciences of learning, then, as I said, we will have a whole generation that is unable to meet the task demands that are going to be put upon it by the global meta crisis. So the meta theory, the human development work, that frames rethinking about education in general. And then I move through several chapters where I look at various aspects of the issues. So one of the most important themes in the book has to do with the extinction of the large school system with centralized factory-like buildings and the obsolescence of that factory model. So this is a picture of Rousseau's Emile, and this is supposedly the only book that got Kant to miss his daily walk. When Immanuel Kant got his copy of Rousseau's Emile, he was so intrigued that he just sat and read it, and that's because it was taking the basic structure of education out of institution and looking at the most kind of primordial dynamic between teacher and student. And it was also thinking about, in a post-conventional way, how can education be something that brings the child to society eventually in such a way that that child can then change society as opposed to fitting in. And so, of course, in the 70s, the great theorist Paul Illich wrote a book called Deschooling Society. And similarly to this vision of Rousseau's, what you're looking at is this radically individualized education without schools in a traditional sense, without walls, right? Where the whole city is a school and the child gets basically the equivalent of an educational credit card, and they can redeem it for time with elders. Right? This is Illich's vision. It's very interesting, but it was written before the internet and before the emergence of both the postmodern and the metamodern kind of structures of feeling and theory. And so what I do in this book is do kind of an integral redux of the deschooling vision and suggest a network of education hubs. And so that was written about in the blurb that John circulated. It's an excerpt of my book that's been online for a while now. And, you know, to summarize, the idea is that I'm arguing that we should literally dismantle the insides of most of our existing schools and replace the basic infrastructure with something that looks more like a combination of a daycare, a co-working center, a library, a museum, and a computer hub. And what this means is that it's going to be a hub where the community organizes using all kinds of resources, which I specify in the book, where community organizes around the intergenerational transmission of knowledge, right? So that instead of having a school in the traditional sense, you have a hub with very different sets of norms about what counts as education and very different ways of tracking and measuring students moving through it, and of organizing pop-up classrooms, and of having tutorials, and of having working groups of kids at different ages. And so what you're looking at is what I call the kind of 21st century one-room schoolhouse. Put all the youth together and put all the resources of the adults together. You can call it a school if you want to, but it doesn't look like a school anymore, especially when it's facilitated by a very sophisticated kind of technological infrastructure, which allows for tracking each student, all the learning opportunities available, basically a complex time and skill sharing network. So that's one of the visions that I lay out. I also do some basic thinking in theoretical metrology, and probably the core chapter of the book has to do with what I call the global crisis of measurement. And it became clear to me as a theorist of education that one of the main things distorting the educational system has to do with the way that we measure it and think about measuring it. And then I started looking around and realized that, wow, a lot of the problems that we're facing globally have to do with the way we measure things and think about measuring them. GDP is a great example. The gross domestic product is still widely used as a index of economic health for policy decision making, and yet it's been known for and argued by economists, even mainstream economists, that in essence we're looking at a simplification that may be more damaging than useful, as opposed to something like the Gini coefficient, which actually represents inequality within the economy, not just the total growth, but the distribution of economic productivity and reward, the Gini coefficient, right? So as an example, and there's literally hundreds, and I discussed many of them in this chapter, of where the basic measurement infrastructure is setting the wrong set of constraints and mapping reality in the wrong way. And having a measurement structure that doesn't work, a measurement infrastructure that is distorted, creates what Bhaskar calls demi-realities, small versions of something that's there. You're tracking something, but you don't know what it is, and it's actually worse. It's worse than flying blind, because you're flying with instruments that you think you can trust, but you can't. So that's important. And then towards the end of the book, I lay out a series of social miracles. And as I've already mentioned, these are conditions for the possibility of real education. And they include really radical suggestions about how we could change the nature of society in order to allow for a different way of fostering intergenerational transmission, which is to say a different form of education would result if we, for example, thought about the world the way Buckminster Fuller did, beyond the traditional boundaries of nation states. One of the things I argue for in the book is a redrawing of the borders and a rethinking of the nature of nationality as part of fostering a cosmopolitan educational initiative. And so that the social miracles chapter is the most utopian, but I think it also shows the real challenge in the clearest way of what we're facing. The basic income guarantee, for example, is characterized as an economic issue, but the basic income guarantee is fundamentally an educational issue. Making that transition and the results of that transition, making that transition would be probably one of the greatest educational challenges we've faced, when you have a generation who didn't have it and then a generation that does. And then, of course, disentangling education from the need to become a wage laborer, disentangling the definition of what it means to be human from what it means to be a wage laborer, right? These things are emerging. And again, I'm saying towards the end of the book that we actually need to revisit the way we think about what it means to be human. The Anthropocene is a significant enough marker of the uniqueness of humanity's power in the universe, which is to say the power to change the nature of a whole planet. And so we need to take that seriously. And it's also worth noting that, one of the most kind of generative and long-lasting, radically alternative educational systems was the Waldorf school. And the Waldorf school model is revered by people who don't even have a religious thought in there. It works. But it's worth noting that it was founded, and all of the founding learning theory and all of the educational structures and even the architecture of these buildings is from an emergent religious worldview of Rudolf Steiner, which incidentally had to do a lot with life and the meaning of death. And so this Alex Gray painting shows that, especially again, as the global crisis deepens and things get more complicated and the numbers of people who are subject to geopolitical violence or ecological catastrophe increases, then we're going to have to deal with some moral conversations in the public sphere and with our children. And so, yes, we're going to need to start thinking about what to say in response to the deepest questions that can be asked by the youth. And right now, we're very inarticulate. And one of the reasons there's been a resurgence of neoconservative, neo-reactionary thought, and even a resurgence of ethno-nationalistic sentiments has to do with the inability of some of the most educated to make sincere and profound responses to the deepest questions that can be asked. So that's kind of the broadest overview of the book. And, from what I just said, it seems like, how could this book possibly have been written? And it took a long time to write. But as a result of it being so much in it, I think it's going to be exciting when it comes out and to see what happens. So I will stop sharing my screen and take questions. So thanks everyone for listening there.